Today I want to do some historical material. That is, I'm going to do the what's the so-called Spanish conquest of Mexico, Cortez and Moctezuma. I don't do a lot of straight ahead historical videos here. The only other really big one I think that I've done is, well, I have one on early Chinese classical history, and then one on Antony and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. So, but in the case of that story, Anthony, Cleopatra, and Julius Caesar, and the case of this story, the conquest of Moctezuma's Mexica empire by Hernan Cortez in the 1500s, around the 1520, it's really something that history is kind of boggles my mind, really, as a humanities teacher, and also as a devotee of literature, fiction, and other art forms. I find with humanities the grain is so fine because, after all, it is reality. It's as deep as can be. The depth that it doesn't have to achieve any depth because it's already real. So I realized somewhere along the way, as an aspiring writer, a young man, that history was, 10 times much more bizarre and fascinating and fantastical than anything people could make up. And that's a really important reason, I think, for looking at the material that we're looking at today, in addition to the importance of understanding this in the context of, for example, here we are living, I'm doing this in Puerto Rico, native North American, teaching Caribbean students. And this is also regional history then of much, much more import than most people, I think, understand. I mean, the lack of consciousness about the sheer scale of the Mesoamerican civilization, for example, I think would really change a lot of people's attitude if that was widely known. Well, anyway, let's get on to that then. And this will be, So I subtitle this then, so Cortez and Moctezuma, and I subtitle this Difficult History. Difficult history. So let me just talk for a second about a couple different senses of difficult history. Difficult history in as much as the sources are various and to various degrees suspect, and this is an intensely politicized historiography. The historiography, the study of the history of, the study of the historians of, and the sources of certain historical topics. So in this case, we are up against a whole bunch of stuff really interlaced in all kinds of interesting ways with the whole issue of colonialism, of European expansion, and so on. Difficult history also, and this is very bloody history and tragic history. This is the history of unbelievable destruction, the human equivalent of unbelievable ecological destruction, just the untold losses. A difficult history also, though, that it's encrusted in a lot of sort of projections and stereotypes. I'm going to try and break that down a little bit. My mantra is all people are the same. Sub-mantra, nobody likes to hear the mantra. So let's take a look then at some of this difficult history. So difficult also to interpret, difficult to do professionally, and the topic is very difficult on a number of levels, including emotional levels. And difficult as well in terms of appreciating the importance for today and the world that we live in today this kind of material has. So for one thing, people have a kind of, I call it the Flintstones effect. In the Flintstones cartoon, and they're driving along in their wooden car, running along in it, and the mountains are behind them, and they're just sort of mountains repeating. There's really nothing around. It's really a pretty barren world. The ancient world, wherever you go, was not an empty sort of landscape with only sort of smatterings of people. It was a rich, full place. And that was certainly true of Mesoamerica in these centuries that we're talking about in the 1400s, and particularly the 1500s, 16th century, and then the 17th century. We'll talk about that a little bit too. So this was an urban place. Millions of people lived there before the Spanish showed up. Millions of people lived there. It was an enormous population on the same kind of scale as the European population. That's something that's important to understand. Another thing that's important to understand about the New World in general, people are always getting this wrong in their projections, is that it was a very dynamic world where different groups were rising and falling, just as we see in the Old World, in the European scene and the Asian historical scene. These things, great empires last for a couple of centuries. And in fact, ethnic groups themselves, which again, in our unreflective mode, we think, oh, well, these people were here living like this for thousands and thousands of years. Well, not really. I mean, depending on what you mean by like this, but no, there was all kinds of evolution, rising and falling, coming to be and passing away of powers. And as in all of history, wherever we look, these things happen fast over the course of a couple centuries. This is also true of the Incas to the south of the Andes Mountains. But in the case of the Mexicas, and by the way, Aztec isn't actually a authentic period word. Aztec was a word that was added on by European scholars later on. These people actually called themselves the Mexicas. They were a tribe who derived from the more nomadic tribes to the north in North America, and they came out of those tribes and came down. And that's important because into this urban, much more developed, socially and economically developed Mesoamerican scene in southern Mexico and Guatemala, that area where we're talking about today. The what we would call the Aztec and the Nahuatl is the main language group there, and then the Mayan lands to the south. And these Mexicas were actually kind of looked down by the Tlaxcalans, and I won't pretend to be able to pronounce all these Nahuatl names because they were newcomers and they were considered sort of nouveau that way. The Mexicas first come and make their appearance in the area as a ethnic group that's being distinguished from the others in the early 1200s in the 13th century. Okay, so these people who are essentially wiped out by Cortez in the beginning of the 16th century, 300 years earlier, is the first that we hear about them showing up from wherever it was they came from up to the north. And about 100 years later, they established Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan, the city, and these are city-states, and Tenochtitlan is one city-state in the midst of others, all of which have different ethnic groups. These are the Mexicas, or the Incas, I mean, not the Incas, I'm sorry, the Aztecs in the traditional word, Incas in the mountains, South America. But what people would have known is Tenochtitlan, the city, the community, and that group of people called the Mexicas, and these other cities, these other city-states, like the ancient Greek city-states to some extent, which would have alliances with each other and be at war with each other. And as I mentioned, the Mexicas were actually somewhat looked down upon by some of their neighbors who they were oppressing militarily and politically at the time. And of course, these are the tensions in the Spanish conquest, again, both parts of the Spanish conquest, the Mexican part and the Incan part. We find that the Europeans came into a setting where there were serious civil problems and even outright civil war. And in the Mexican setting, you had war between states that was active and hostile. And so one of the things that made for Cortez's victory was he allied himself with the enemies of Moctezuma, who was the most powerful leader. So he understood the politics of that. So in the beginning of the 14th century, you get Tenochtitlan is established, the city is established. It hasn't been there for thousands of years. It doesn't come from outer space. It's a powerful and big and beautiful city with a big economy, with a huge market, a legendary market that might have as many as 50,000 people in it at a time, as far as we can tell from the reports. And 100 years later, what we find is it has built itself into a very large regional power, major regional power, whose trading relationships and political relationships extend for many, many hundreds of kilometers in all directions. The other thing we're seeing, as we see anywhere else, including Europe, is the expansion of the population and the economy is happening, getting greater urbanization at this time. Maybe upwards of 150,000 people in the city, not a big city by modern standpoint. Athens, ancient Athens in the middle of the 5th century BCE, in about the same kind of shape with maybe 100,000 people. Mayaguez, Puerto Rico, where I live, a city of about 100,000 people down to about 90,000 people now. So, so Moctezuma the First, who was gone by the time the Spaniards got there, because, by the way, because this was an important power, and they did have records, these painted records called Codices that we're going to talk about in a minute here. We know a great deal about the lineage of Moctezuma, about the royal lineage and the political leadership of the Mexica for 200 years prior to the arrival of Cortez in 1519. And we know a great deal about it. We know about the rivalries. We have records of the personalities. It's another thing I would say as a humanities teacher, that Fred Flintstone effect that I mentioned. People have no idea how much is known. This is true about the Mesopotamian Bronze Age civilizations, ancient China, Africa, although there's obviously lots of work to be done in excavating the history of Africa, but there's a tremendous amount that's known. There's a tremendous amount that's known about the history of the Mesoamericans, pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. It's really quite astounding how much is known, including the political back and forth for generations before Cortez made the scene. So one thing, as I would say again, as a teacher of humanities, I notice is that people have no idea how much we know. Same in the history of art. People have no idea how many pieces of art by how many artists there are to study. All right. So Cortez arrives in 1519, and it takes 2 years of hard fighting. Cortez arrives. The first people he encounters try to fight him off, and they have a big battle, but then they realize that Cortez might be useful to them, and they become allies with Cortez. He has other encounters, including Cortez actually has to go and fight off Spaniards who have come to try and suppress him and stop him from being the conquistador of Mexico. He is in the city, Tenochtitlan, for a time, and then is driven out in a bloody rout called the Noche de Triste, when many of his own men are killed, and he has to lay siege to the city for another year, at the end of which he figures out how to cut off the water supply to Tenochtitlan, which is one of the last ways that he overcomes the city. It's ordinary warfare, folks. It's not some kind of magical thing. They do have horses, and they do have iron weapons. So here, just to illustrate that again, you see Tenochtitlan in the center there. This is, remember, Cortez arrives in 1519. This is a political map that extends back to 1427, 100 years before that. And you see the give and take and this big fabric of city-states that were allied with each other, enemies of each other. There were different ethnic groups. There were different language groups. A big dynamic world, a politically and culturally and socially and economically complicated world. By the way, you get Hernan Cortez marches from Veracruz to Tenochtitlan. Along the way, it's not a plunder situation. I mean, they're doing diplomacy. They have to buy things. I mean, he has to make deals with people. He has to find local people to buy food. He has to get more money. I mean, he has to do business like that through the whole thing. That's another aspect of this. People have this myth of the Spanish conquest that it was just some sort of magic poof and everything fell over. There's been so many back and forths in terms of the way we project political stuff onto the conquest. And that's one of the things I want to talk about in a minute here. Just quickly about Hernan Cortez himself. An interesting character, not a larger than life character. Actually, he comes across as a somewhat humble man. He had noble status because of his lineage, and his noble status gave him the right to ask for certain licenses, including during his years in Cuba, the license to own slaves, which he had. because, again, he was of the nobility. But he was déclassé. I mean, he didn't have money. And so Cortez was always sort of looked down upon and shunted to the side. I mean, the more important posts went to people who had a higher class status, came from better families than Cortez did. I mean, that's the bottom line. At the same time, so Cortez benefited from his nobility, but he also was obstructed by it. At the same time, he did have his whole gestalt of loyalty to the crown and being in service of Spain, and Charles V, who was also the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. Cortez was an educated person. He knew how to write. And in fact, there are his letters to Charles V, and those are worth looking at. I should have put some photographs of them in here, I meant to, but they're actually very well written and some very interesting original source documents, because it's describing from the field at the time in 1519, 1520, what it's like, what the vistas are, what the rivers are like, what the towns along the rivers are like, and that kind of stuff. Bernal Diaz is a Spanish priest who is also on this expedition, keeping a diary. And that also, you can buy that, a copy of that, and it's very interesting stuff. Cortez is really not without talent. For one thing, Cortez understands that he's got to get around all these Spanish grandees, particularly Velasquez, the governor of Cuba, who wants to be the one who conquers the Mexicans and is on to Cortez, but Cortez has already stolen a march and gotten leave to take his ships. And when Cortez makes his final landfall in Mexico, he burns the ships. He burns his ships so that people can't go back. This is how dedicated he is. And then he ignores, summonses to come back. And he goes and goes about it. And subsequently, he writes these letters, which did get a lot of attention. And Cortez was not entirely unsuccessful in his petitions to the crown because of his achievements. He ended up on a pension in Spain, living out his old age. But he was very much looked down upon by these officers who came from more senior families. It's kind of war and peace kind of thing. He obviously, one of the things that comes through about Cortez in the period writings that we have is that he was a really, really good cavalry officer. He had about 400 horses, greatly diminished, of course, by the end. But these were the first horses that anyone in the New World had ever seen. And they gave him a tremendous advantage, as well as he had hundreds of foot soldiers as well, armor and iron weapons, as I said. But none of that would have done them any good, either if they had suffered a full-scale, a concerted attack, which they never did for various reasons, or if they had not had a good officer who understood military maneuvering and who was rather intellectual about it, and that was Hernan Cortez, who was really good at it. So a very talented person, and a person of great brass, I must say, but a person who was up against it. There's a sad story about his later years when they were putting together a military expedition to North Africa, and he volunteered to lead it, and he was kind of sort of laughed off by them. And I think that was the point where he decided that he would retire, because people just they didn't respect him at the time. They respected the Pizarro brothers and their conquest of the Incas, which was very dramatic, and the things that they sent back were so dramatic, there was so much of it, that Cortez kind of got overshadowed by that in his own life. He had small mounted cavalry and several hundred foot soldiers. I don't know how many mounted cavalry, maybe I overstated that. The Tlaxcalans, and the Tlaxcalans in particular were rather bitter enemies of the Mexicas, because the Tlaxcalans sort of looked down on the Mexicas. And so they were his eager allies, and he did travel with large armies, the other major power in the region. As I say, third bullet point is what I was just talking about, noble ancestors and a brilliant officers. And so what I was saying is, what comes through in the reports is people out in the field, when they were besieged by their enemies, everybody understood that if Cortez wasn't there, they would all die, because Cortez knew what to do. I mean, there is an art to sort of moving cavalry around, and he understood what that was. So everyone got it that without him, the whole thing was over. And as I say, they had 2 years campaign. The low point was in June of 1520 when they were forced to flee from Tenochtitlan for the first time, when Moctezuma was killed by stone-slinging Mexica warriors who were disenchanted with him. He was with the Spanish. The Spanish lost a great many of their people. They called it La Noche de Triste, the sad night. And then it was another year of siege before Cortez managed to topple the city, which he did. It wasn't some sort of easy thing, and it wasn't some sort of magical thing. It was good old-fashioned warfare thing. The Codices. Now, this is important because, as I say, because of the nature of this sort of toppling over of an indigenous Mesoamerican civilization by the European invaders, there has been a whole bunch of waves of sort of revisionist history and revisionist history around this, and I do want to talk about that. So they had a tradition, the Nahuatl-speaking peoples, of these codices. What are they? They're folded objects, often painted on wood, gessoed, which I thought was kind of interesting. And they have pictorial depictions. The flavor of it is somewhat similar to Egyptian hieroglyphic sort of funerary inscriptions and instructions. So, so they had this tradition, and they had codices going back for a couple of hundred years. Another, of course, thing that we hear is that the Spanish destroyed a great deal of this material in order to sort of wipe out what they took to be the pagan stuff. That is true, unfortunately true, but that doesn't mean we don't have any pre-Columbian codices. And the reason that that's an important thing to mention is that because some of the codices of the 1500s, the 16th century, were produced by Nahuatl artists, but under control of, or the direction of, Spanish Catholic authorities, then there's some question as to their veracity. And so one thing that you can take away is that, well, we have quite a few of them. We have, I would mention, second bullet point, an interesting cadre of writers about 100 years later, at the beginning of the 17th century, who are mixed race people who have actually grown up all their lives in this Spanish colonial environment and are bilingual in Nahuatl and Spanish. And their accounts are also interesting. I did see one academic investigation that claimed to show that the native accounts are the most favorable to the natives and the Europeans the least, and the ones in the middle, these interesting ones in the middle, are in the middle, which makes sense. But last two bullet points on this slide. We know a lot more about this. For one thing, now we have whole cadres of academic scholars who understand Nahuatl. And so there's that, but we also have much, much better archaeological, physical evidence and ongoing anthropological studies. And so another thing about ancient civilization, I mentioned that we tend to know a lot more than I find ordinary people think that we know. I find that people haven't studied ancient history, tend to think that we know very, very little, that it's all sort of shrouded in mist. And of course, there is a lot that we don't know, but people have no idea how much we do know, I find. So here, nowadays, we know a lot more, for example, about ancient Greece and Rome, and we know a lot more about it because we have a lot more physical evidence. We have a lot more understanding of textual evidence than we used to. The same thing goes for this pre-Columbian Mesoamerican stuff and Conquest period stuff. I want to look at some of these codices just to show them to you. It's beautiful stuff. Again, like Egyptian hieroglyphics, it's very sort of serious stuff. It's everything's not there whimsically, but rather is there by fairly well-ordered formal codes. But the draftsmanship is quite amazing, and the figures of the costumes, the ceremonial costumes of the royalty are also quite amazing. The warriors here, you'll notice the turquoise color. They had a lot of turquoise, of course. Another thing they were really good at was making turquoise jewelry and turquoise mosaics. They have a really accomplished mosaic tradition. I'm going to show you a couple of mosaic pieces by Mexica. And a lot of it was calendrical. They had prophecies. This is straight ahead ancient history or old history like we find everywhere around the world. It's agricultural based. It's about understanding the turning of the seasons. Remember, you have very, very many hundreds of plants and animals, and you need to know all sorts of things about which ones to plant before and which ones after the vernal equinox and all the rest of it. And again, this is true of all old civilizations. And so that's a fair amount of what we're looking at. And then with regular prophecies about what's going to happen on such and such a day in the future. Just very excellent draftsmanship and absolutely fascinating images. And you could spend a lifetime studying these images because a lot is known about them. Giving you some details of some larger images. And the jaguar, of course, always very prominent spirit animal in Mesoamerica. So now there's another story about the conquest of Mexico that Moctezuma thought that Cortez was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of wisdom. It's not clear. It's hard to get to the bottom of it, but some of it is true. I would minimize the amazingness of it all, and I think Moctezuma was very careful. Moctezuma eventually, remember, loses the confidence of his own people. He, very shortly after coming into contact with Cortez starts to dominate him. And sometimes people say, well, this is because, a standard thing people say is this is because Moctezuma was worried that Cortez was Quetzalcoatl. I think it's sort of easy to overstate that. I think it may be that the leader here, the king, Moctezuma, was a man who was perhaps not forceful enough and decisive enough in the event to do some of the things that needed to be done. And the leaders that came after him tried to fight back the way they ought to have, but it was too little too late. So what's really going on then with this prophecy and the myth of the return of the feathered serpent and everything? What are the outlines of that? Again, it's an old world and new world thing. It's basically about a cycle of birth and rebirth. Remember, someone going down and then coming back up is something that we find throughout the folkloric traditions of all of the European civilizations, Demeter and Zeus and Jesus and all the rest of it. So you have a cycle, a 51-year cycle, where Quetzalcoatl, he's the god of light and wisdom. He's not the sun god, and this is a sun worship. We're going to get to the sun god in a minute here. This is a sun god worshiping culture who also, like the Egyptians, identified their royalty with the sun. And so it's this notion that Quetzalcoatl will return in a 51-year cycle. And it appears as if, and this I would say is the most remarkable or startling coincidence, if true, that their calendar told them that that would be 1519, around 1519, which is when the Spanish showed up. Now, Quetzalcoatl was of the north, and so typically of icons of the north, he was of a lighter He was pictured as a lighter skinned, and apparently as also having black hair and a beard, maybe. And of course, Cortez and the Europeans were lighter skinned and had their beards and more body hair. So that's what it is. Really, that's what you got. As far as Moctezuma thinking that maybe Cortez was Quetzalcoatl. Now, more importantly, though, you have a society that takes this astrologically driven kind of system of prophecy very, very seriously in terms of making their decisions. And it was said that Quetzalcoatl would return to where he came from, to his home. And so one thing that Moctezuma did was try not to encounter Cortez. And then when he finally did encounter Cortez, he invited Cortez in Spanish into Tenochtitlan. Those were judgments that he made. Now, it doesn't look to me like it's very likely that all of that was driven by dogmatic prophecy around Quetzalcoatl. But it looks like it was there. I mean, then there's another line that, well, all of that was made up later, but that doesn't appear to be the case to me. And actually said now one of the places we're going to go and what's left of this is looking at some other controversial issues and what's going on with history around them. But here's the Sunstone Calendar. It was made probably within 20 or 30 years prior to Hernan Cortez showing up. It itself has an amazing history as being on the walls of various cathedrals and various other places for many centuries. Until today, it's in the Museo de Arqueología y Antropología, or Historia, in Mexico City, where I saw it. And it's big. It's really big. It's a lot bigger than I thought. It dominates the room. And the room has all these other Mesoamerican carved, sort of rounded carved animal figures in it. I had a dream once where I was in that room. I don't know if they still have that display up in Mexico City, and they all came to life. But there's the Sunstone, the famous iconic Sunstone Calendar. They had really good art, a lot of really good art. Among other things, they have mosaic, which is interesting. I have another video about Roman mosaic. The Mexica and the Mesoamericans in general have some really striking mosaic pieces, and they made very nice jewelry and costumes. You noticed already in some of those from one codex or another, some of those drawings, they had those fantastic costumes. In the Incas apparently valued some of their costumes and textiles more than their gold and took them down into the Amazon so the Spanish wouldn't get them. I was kind of struck by that pottery. And pre-Columbian ceramics, there's a lot of it, a lot of different kinds of it. It's all really good. If you're an artist and you're thinking about how to decorate your ceramics, I really recommend looking at pre-Columbian ceramics for decorative ideas. Another mask, maybe a Quetzalcoatl or another ritual mask. Again, it's a mosaic made out of turquoise. And there are quite a few of these. Some of these also have human bones. There are decorated skulls. Very nice. Wooden drum. You beat on the top of it with mallets, hollow inside. 15th century, 1400s, maybe 50 to 100 years before the arrival of the Spanish. Here's a drawing of someone using it with their big drum that now we all know. And a lot of these monoliths we find in various different temples. Some of them are really quite striking. So the last thing I want to talk about here then is this issue of cannibalism. Now, one thing that happened in the 1970s and 1980s is there developed a pretty strong force of academics who argued that actually there hadn't really been any Mesoamerican cannibalism at all, and that had just simply been made up to dehumanize the Americans, the Native Americans, in order to make it easier for people to accept the cultural genocide of the Native American civilizations by the Europeans. All of which very sympathetic and so on. But what I want to do, there's been a lot of stuff. I didn't know about some of this stuff. There's been a lot of work in the last 40 or 50 years about some of these claims. And we want to take a look at what some of the sort of state-of-the-art assessment of Mesoamerican cannibalism is. First bullet point here, the colonial era reports wanted to show that they were depraved. Of course, they wanted they did want to express the depraved condition of pagan people, and also that they were uncivilized. Notice that first bullet point, I put uncivilized in quotation marks, because they were not uncivilized after all. I mean, the thing that really jumps out about Tenochtitlan and the whole campaign is the urban nature. Even out in the field, the Spanish are always in all of these villages with markets. So, there was a very large civilization. And so again, maybe some of the Spanish writers were invested in not recognizing that what they were looking at clearly was, in fact, an evolved civilization. Bernal Diaz reports seeing meat shops, butcher shops that sold human flesh along with other kinds of flesh. I'm just giving my own opinion now, and having spent the last few days trying to get to the bottom of this. I doubt that. The reason that I doubt that is because human flesh was really meant to be eaten by the nobility. That's kind of a tantric, if you understand what that means, kind of practice. And it was only done on ceremonial occasions. It was part of their sun worship. And so I doubt very much, first of all, that ordinary people could go to the store and to the market and buy human flesh. I doubt it. And I doubt that the idea of an ordinary person eating human flesh because they just were hungry and needed to make a sandwich, I also am highly skeptical that was ever the case. Second bullet point, in the 20th century, post-colonial revisionism led to widespread skepticism about cannibalism. And so, among other things, since a lot of the old codices had been destroyed, both by the Spanish and also by the natives, by the Mesoamericans. And by the way, it appears as if about 100 years before Cortez, one of the Mexica rulers systematically destroyed a lot of the older codices because he was trying to rewrite history with himself at the center and with himself as the beginning. So that kind of context and kind of factor, I think, sort of abounds in this sort of thing. Anyway, so then the question is, if you're getting into the middle of the 20th century and it's sort of post-1960s and you're an academic and you want to say, I don't think these people were cannibals at all. And then we have all these codices from the 1500s that give us all the pictures of ritual cannibalism, pictures of people being sacrificed on altars and so on. What is that? And then the implication would be, well, that was just made up by the Spanish. But they made these people make those. Last bullet point, archaeological research in the past few decades indicate that, in fact, there was a fairly, what we would think, I mean, how much is too much, how much is a lot of cannibalism? I mean, one of the things I want to reflect on, if we can, is, how much in sort of saying that cannibalism is some kind of taboo. I mean, what that sort of means. There's a writer nowadays, I forget her name, but she rather cheerfully writes about how much meat human meat they ate, sort of going in the other direction. But I mean, I guess what I would want to suggest is that, yes, maybe various historical factors led to there being a practice of cannibalism in this civilization, this Mesoamerican civilization. But I mean, how much worse does that make these people than, people in other places? Yeah, I think that's a reasonable question. So, all right, so let's take a little bit more. Some recent archaeological findings Just here's 4 points for your delectation. Take 105 of these relaciones. These are official reports that the local bureaucrats had to file with the throne every year, supposedly. So they gathered 105 of those between the years 1577 and 86. Remember, it was 1520, and it was 1521 that Cortez finally defeated Tenochtitlan for at the end. So this is 50 years later. And 40 of those mentioned cannibalism, incidents of cannibalism. Anthropologists studying the Xiximes ethnic group of northern Mexico, doing archaeological work, this isn't looking at tribal groups that there are now, this is looking at their ancient history as well. The Xiximes, I don't know how to pronounce it, and another related group would have these ritualized war methods where they would sacrifice and eat the prisoners. But the takeaway from that study was only if you were within that larger ethnic group. If you're outside of that group, then you weren't part of it. And part of that has to do, I think, with the sort of meaning of these practices, these cannibalistic practices, that one is helping one's own people with the sun. Now, I mentioned there that the Mexican royalty similarly thought Spanish flesh unclean. You got a lot of stories about how the Spanish had to listen to the Mexicans eating the Spanish soldiers they had caught. They would catch them and eat them. That also may or may not be untrue, although I think to some extent, some of that must probably be true, because they also, remember, these are just people. I mean, they can break the taboo. They can fool around with it. They can try and terrify the Europeans if they know the Europeans are terrified of the practice. They're probably not the first people that they've used cannibalism to terrorize. And not only that, but if you look at the third bullet point there, Tecuaque, where they were eaten. And so Velasquez, the governor of Cuba, had sent an expedition to go and get Cortez and make contact with Cortez. He's mad at Cortez. And that expedition was captured by these other people. They're not Mexicans. They're related to them. It's between the one big city and the other. And they keep these people. And one of the things that's characteristic of these human sacrificial processes is they have these sort of cages or room cells where they fatten the people up for a few months before they sacrifice them. And that's something that appears to be, it's sort of part of the whole thing. It's part of the whole ritual. And that apparently was done with some of the Spanish people at this place. And apparently people came from other distant villages to see this. So maybe they were making some money off of this as well. Remember, these are some local people now. They've captured these Spanish people and they're killing them. That looks to me as if it's a kind of off the books kind of use of these practices to terrorize these people. And, why not? Of course that happened. But most importantly, and I'll show you some slides here, the last bullet point on that slide, the Templo Mayor, the main ritual of center, the main temple of the Mexica at the time, which has been under extensive excavation, and there are very recent findings in the excavations there that are startling. And really, they all tend to move towards confirmation that, yes, these ritual sacrifices did occur, as a matter of fact. Skull racks with hundreds of victims where you have holes drilled through the skull so they'll fit on these poles. And the number is clearly meaningful. And they've discovered now there's one, as also reported in a codex from the late 16th century. And the other thing that there had been reports of for a long time, but people had not been able to confirm, is walls around temples made out of skulls mortared together. And they have found that now in the Temple Mayor. They have found several walls made out of skulls that have been mortared together to be used as masonry. That was legendary, but within the last 20 years or so, we know that wasn't just a legend. That's real. So then just looking at this, and just to make an assessment, again, the current view of Mesoamerican cannibalism, but judging by what we've seen about the way people treat the issue, we don't, we can't have too much confidence that we understand it. But my take on it at this point would be something like this. It appears that it serves some important ritualistic purposes. For a long time, I heard this many years ago, and it is a sort of common sense thesis. There was a thesis that on the high Mexican plateau, there wasn't enough big game, there wasn't enough animal protein, and that in order to make up the deficit in animal protein, they had evolved this custom of ritual sacrifice of prisoners taken in these kind of ritualistic battles that were aimed more at taking prisoners and killing people. That is not accepted mostly by the research community today. One simple reason for that is that it just doesn't look as if there really was any problem with getting enough animal protein in that part of the world. After all, it's a theory that's attractive because it's anthropological theory. It says because of some underlying nutritional requirement, you get a practice, and anthropologists love materialist explanations like that. But it doesn't look like it's true. It doesn't look as if it was the kind of thing where there was enough human meat, that you could buy it in the market. And of course, there are stories that such and such an emperor sacrificed 20,000 young boys or something like that at some big ceremony. And there isn't anything on that kind of scale. There are some excesses, because it's true, the bigger the sacrifice. Second bullet point, Quetzalcoatl, or however you say that, the sun god. All right, and so it's a votive temple culture that worships the sun god. It's very similar to, a lot of Hindu sects. Everybody does that. That is sacrificial offerings, coming to be and passing away. And royalty were taken to be related to the gods, as with the Egyptians. Then you'd have might have this practice where they too might partake of this flesh, or the priest might partake of the flesh, because they are then unto the gods, right? They are like the gods in that way, or they can be the vessels of the gods in participating in this tantric practice of eating the human flesh. And it's true that on these big feast days, when royalty would have the ceremony and eat the human flesh, ordinary folks would make bread in the shape of bodies. In Mexico, you still have the Day of the Dead and everything. And that's another thing I wanted to remember to mention. I mean, it's you get Aztec, what we call Aztec art, as a major sort of death cult, death fetish side to it. It really does. And that is still a tradition kind of tied in with Mariolatry and other overlays in Mexico and today. So, and as I say, last bullet point, sure, it does look like, you think, oh, well, this was sacred. And well, nothing's really that sacred. I mean, it looks like in that case, what happened at Tecoaque was that some local people kind of took matters into their own hands, and they got a little outside the guidelines of what the cannibalism was supposed to be. And I'm sure that happened more than once, because, it's around that eating human flesh is sometimes all right. Okay, so what would I want to stress then, just again, giving you this kind of really basic introduction, just wanting to do something with the Spanish conquest here. A lot of really interesting material, this indigenous Mexican material, these codices and the rest of it. And then you've got the question of the different kinds of witnesses. You got this kind of Rashomon historiography, where there's quite a lot of Spanish writing. And then you've also got this issue of bringing in the Nahuatl. People are moving from pictorial and using written language that's coming in from Europe. And so there's a lot of stuff to look at there. And there's the whole question of what can we see in modern American society, modern Mexican society, and elsewhere, that we can recognize some of this history there. And there's also, as humanities students, there's just, as I said at the beginning, the unbelievable texture of this kind of history. It's so much larger than life and yet actually real. And that's something that I think if I'm deciding sort of what to include in a humanities class that's of a strictly historical nature, other stuff like the French Revolution and things that you sort of can't avoid, but then I think the criteria have to be around this kind of striking insights into the human condition just all around. But anyway, I'll leave that to you. Spanish Conquest, as it's called. Lots of interesting writings, including lots of interesting books from our time on this issue. All right, I'll leave it at that.